In the heart of America's farmland, a battle of wills is about to unfold that will shock the conscience of a nation. When Platinum Development Group sets their sights on Margaret Wilson's century-old farm, they think they're dealing with just another elderly widow they can bully into submission. They couldn't be more wrong. At 90 years old, Margaret Wilson isn't your typical grandmother. She's the keeper of secrets that would make the most hardened corporate raiders tremble, and she's about to prove that age is just a number when you're fighting for everything you love. This isn't just another story about big business versus the little guy. This is about how one of America's most ruthless development companies learned the hard way that some old farmers have friends in very high places. When they came to seize her land through intimidation and force, they didn't realize they were starting a war with a woman who had spent 7 decades keeping secrets for the most elite military units in U.S. history. What follows is the story of how a 90-year-old widow brought a billion-dollar corporation to its knees with a single phone call, proving that you're never too old to fight back, and some debts of honor never expire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost crunched under Margaret Wilson's boots as she made her daily rounds of the family farm. At 90, she moved with a deliberate grace that belied her age, her weathered hands strong from decades of working the land. The rising sun painted the wheat fields gold, the same view she'd woken to for 70 years, ever since James had brought her here as a young bride in 1953. "Another beautiful morning, James," she whispered to the wind, a habit she'd developed in the 5 years since his passing. The old farmhouse stood proud against the dawn sky, its red paint faded but maintained, much like Margaret herself. She paused at the fence line, her sharp blue eyes scanning the property with the same attention to detail that had helped them survive drought, recession, and countless corporate buyout attempts. Inside her kitchen, steam rose from a coffee cup next to a stack of threatening letters from Platinum Development Group. Margaret ignored them, just as she'd ignored their phone calls and their increasingly aggressive representatives. Instead, she focused on the collection of photographs lining her walls, each one telling a story of the life she and James had built. There was their wedding photo. James in his military dress uniform, fresh from Korea, standing tall and proud. Next to her, another showed them with their first harvest, both covered in dust but grinning with the triumph of youth. The most recent ones showed their grandchildren playing in the same fields she now protected, the 5th generation to call this land home. Few knew the full story of how they'd acquired the farm. It had been more than just a land purchase. It had been a reward of sorts, though Margaret never spoke of the details. James had done something significant during his military service, something that had earned the gratitude of people in very high places. The farm had been their way of saying thank you, sold to them at a price a young military couple could afford. "Your father's secrets kept us safe all these years," Margaret said to the portrait of her late husband, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "Never thought we'd need them again at my age." The kitchen radio crackled with the local farm report, but Margaret was focused on a different kind of news. 3 neighboring farms had sold to Platinum in the past month alone. The Henderson place, the Browns' old homestead, and even the Mitchell farm, which had been in the family since the Civil War. Each sale was like a personal betrayal, though. Margaret understood the pressure her neighbors faced. She pulled out James's old logbook from behind a loose brick in the fireplace, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, written in his precise military hand, were names and numbers that hadn't been used in nearly 50 years. Margaret had memorized them all, understanding their importance, even though James had never explicitly explained them. He'd simply told her one night after too many close calls in Korea, "If anything ever happens to me, if anyone ever threatens what we've built here, these people will help. They owe me their lives, and in our world, that debt never expires." The sound of expensive tires on gravel caught her attention. Through her kitchen window, she watched a black SUV pull up to her gate. Two men in expensive suits emerged, their polished shoes unsuited for farm life. Margaret recognized the younger one, David Chen, Platinum's lead acquisitions manager. The older man was new, probably brought in to deal with what they saw as a stubborn old woman. Margaret squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of 70 years of history supporting her like armor. These men saw an easy target, a 90-year-old widow living alone on prime development land. They didn't understand that this farm wasn't just property to her. It was a legacy built on sacrifice, honor, and secrets that had shaped the course of military history. As she watched them approach her porch, Margaret's hand brushed against the logbook. She hadn't wanted to make that call, to disturb the peace of men who'd served with her husband so long ago. But as the developers' tactics had grown more aggressive, as mysterious accidents began plaguing her farm, she'd realized that sometimes the past needed to be awakened. "Time to show them what they're really dealing with," Margaret murmured, straightening her apron and moving to answer the door. She'd face them first with the quiet strength that had sustained her through war, loss, and hardship. But if they pushed too far, they'd learn why James had always said she was the strongest soldier he'd ever known, even if she'd never worn a uniform. The Henderson farm burned on a Tuesday. Margaret watched from her porch as black smoke billowed into the autumn sky, her hands gripping her coffee mug so tight her knuckles turned white. The fire department called it an electrical fault, just like they'd labeled the Browns' barn fire last month. But Margaret knew better. Nothing in farming country happened by coincidence, especially not after refusing Platinum Development Group's generous offers. Sarah Henderson stood beside her, tears streaming down her weathered face. At 65, she was the youngest of the old guard of farmers, and now she was about to become the latest casualty of progress. "They're saying the insurance won't cover it," Sarah whispered. "Something about outdated wiring voiding the policy. Tom's heart can't take another harvest season without proper storage. We'll have to sell." Margaret reached out and squeezed her friend's hand. The Hendersons had been their neighbors for 4 generations. Their children had grown up together, shared Sunday dinners, helped each other through droughts and storms. Now they'd become another empty plot in Platinum's growing collection. From her vantage point, Margaret could see the changes eating away at their farming community like rust on old machinery. To the east, where the Mitchell farm had stood proud for over 150 years, earth movers were already flattening the land for what Platinum called Paradise Valley Estates. The billboard promised luxury homes with authentic rural charm, starting at just $750,000. "Did you hear about Bill's accident?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping lower. "His brakes failed on the way to the grain elevator. He's okay, but—" "Margaret, he'd just rejected their final offer that morning." Margaret nodded. Grimly, the pattern was becoming clear to anyone who cared to look. First came the friendly offers, then the pressure, and finally the accidents that made selling the only option. Platinum Development Group had perfected the art of making resistance seem more costly than surrender. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove her old pickup into town for the weekly farmers' market, another tradition fading faster than morning dew. Where once dozens of local farmers had sold their produce, now only a handful of stands remained. The parking lot was half full of luxury SUVs belonging to weekenders who wanted to play at country living. Margaret, Joe Chen, the local insurance agent and brother to Platinum's David Chen, waved her over. His friendly smile didn't reach his eyes. "Been thinking about your policy. With all these accidents lately, might be time to review your coverage. Rates are going up for older properties, you know." "My policy's fine, Joe," Margaret replied coolly. James always said good insurance is like a good fence, best when it doesn't need fixing. The mention of James made Joe shift uncomfortably. Everyone in town remembered James Wilson, the quiet farmer who'd somehow afforded prime land on a soldier's pension. There had always been whispers about his military service, about the mysterious visitors who stopped by the farm late at night. In the early years, at the vegetable stand, Margaret found Betty Mitchell arranging the last of her family's harvest. "It's our final market," Betty explained, wiping away tears. "Signing the papers tomorrow. They say they'll name a street after Dad, Mitchell Lane. Like that makes up for taking everything he built." Margaret's heart ached. Samuel Mitchell had been one of James's closest friends, another veteran who understood the value of keeping certain secrets. Now his daughter was selling their legacy because the property taxes had mysteriously tripled this year. As she drove home, Margaret counted the coming soon signs staking their claim on her community. Paradise Valley estates, luxury farm homes, authentic country living, each promise written in gold letters over images of manufactured rustic charm. They were selling a fantasy of rural life while destroying the real thing. Back at her farm, Margaret parked next to the old oak tree where James had proposed to her all those years ago. The evening light caught the edges of new construction on the horizon, a growing wall of progress threatening to swallow everything she held dear. Inside, she pulled out James's logbook again, running her fingers over the names and numbers. She'd promised him she'd only use these contacts in the direst circumstances. Looking out at the burning remains of the Henderson farm, watching another piece of their community crumble, Margaret knew that time had come. "They think they're just fighting. One old woman," she said to James's photo. "Time to show them what they're really up against." The sun set behind the development sites, casting long shadows across her fields. Tomorrow, Platinum would come with another offer, thinking the Henderson fire would soften her resolve. Instead, they'd learn why James had chosen this particular piece of land and why certain debts of honor never fade. Paradise Valley hadn't always been paradise. Margaret remembered when they first arrived, how James had stood in the middle of the overgrown fields, his military compass in hand, surveying the land with tactical precision. "It's perfect," he'd said, though back then it had looked anything but. The soil was rocky, the fences broken, the old farmhouse more suitable for horses than humans. But James had seen something else, something strategic. Now, 70 years later, Margaret understood why. Their farm sat at the valley's heart, controlling the watershed that fed every field for miles. The gentle ridge behind their house offered clear views in all directions, and the winding access road forced visitors to approach in plain sight. James had chosen it like a general selecting high ground. The morning paper lay on her kitchen table, its headline announcing Platinum's latest triumph. Paradise Valley Development Promises Economic Boom. Below was a photo of David Chen shaking hands with the mayor, both men grinning over a map of their planned community. Margaret's farm sat squarely in the center, marked as Phase 3 of their project. "Mrs. Wilson," a soft voice called from her porch. It was Jenny Mitchell, Betty's 16-year-old daughter, clutching a cardboard box. "Mom said to bring you these. Great-grandma's preserves recipes. She said you'd keep them safe since we won't have the orchard anymore." Margaret welcomed the girl in, noting how Jenny's eyes lingered on the old photos, particularly those showing her grandfather Samuel with James. "Your grandpa was one of the bravest men I ever knew," Margaret said, setting out cookies she'd baked that morning. "Did they ever tell you about his service?" Jenny shook her head. "Dad says Grandpa never talked about the war, just like your husband didn't." "Some stories aren't ours to tell," Margaret replied, though her mind wandered to late-night conversations overheard, code words and coordinates exchanged between old soldiers who trusted each other with more than just farming advice. The sound of construction equipment drifted through her window, the constant background noise of their changing world. Where the brown farm had stood, cement trucks now poured foundations for luxury homes. The billboard promised authentic farm views, views that would soon show nothing but other houses. Sheriff Tom Parker's patrol car pulled up her drive, gravel crunching under his tires. He'd been James's hunting partner for 20 years, one of the few who knew there was more to the old farmer than met the eye. "Thought you should know, Margaret. They've started pressuring the county commission about eminent domain, claiming the valley's development is in the public interest." Margaret's hands stilled on her coffee cup. "They can't seize private property. Just for profit, Tom. They can if they convince enough people it's for progress. Schools, infrastructure, jobs. They're painting a pretty picture." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's talk about reassessing property taxes, too. They've got someone in the assessor's office, same thing they did to the Mitchells." Through her window, Margaret watched Jenny walking home along the fence line, her shadow long in the afternoon light. The girl's shoulders bore the same proud set as her grandfather's, even in defeat. 4 generations of Mitchell blood and sweat had nourished that land, and now it would grow nothing but identical houses with 3-car garages. "James always said there were 2 kinds of fights," Margaret mused, more to herself than the sheriff. "The ones you can win with fists, and the ones you win with friends." She touched the spine of James's logbook, hidden beneath her recipe box. "Think it's time to call in some friends, Tom?" The sheriff nodded slowly. He'd been there for James's funeral, had noticed the handful of straight-backed older men who'd stood apart from the other mourners. Men with vigilant eyes and military bearing who'd spoken to Margaret in low voices about debts and promises. "Whatever you're planning, Margaret," he said, rising to leave, "just remember you're not alone. Plenty of us still remember what James did for this valley." As evening settled over Paradise Valley, Margaret sat on her porch, listening to the echoes of construction, mixing with the timeless sounds of farm country. Cattle lowed in distant pastures, crickets tuned up for their nightly chorus, and somewhere an owl called its eternal question. She opened James's logbook one last time, her fingers finding the first name on the list. General Marcus Iron Mike Crawford, now retired, but still commanding respect in circles that mattered. James had saved his life in Korea, though the official record showed nothing but a routine patrol. "Time to wake up old ghosts," Margaret whispered to the gathering dark. Tomorrow, Platinum Development would learn that Paradise Valley's soil held more than just agricultural secrets. Some debts lay buried deeper than property lines, waiting for the right moment to sprout. The 3 black SUVs arrived at precisely 9 a.m., their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun like armor. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as 8 men emerged, led by David Chen in his $1,000 suit. This wasn't a normal negotiation visit. They'd brought muscle this time, men whose suit jackets couldn't quite hide their shoulder holsters. "Quite a welcoming committee," Margaret muttered to herself, calmly pouring a second cup of coffee. She'd been expecting this ever since the Henderson fire. Through her window, she watched them spread out across her front yard in a practiced formation. 2 men circled toward her back door, while another photographed her property with a professional camera. They moved with military precision, but not the disciplined kind James had possessed. These were men who'd learned their tactics from private security firms, not battlefield experience. The doorbell rang. Margaret took her time answering, first sliding James's logbook into its hiding place. When she opened the door, David Chen's practiced smile greeted her, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson," he said smoothly, "I hope we're not interrupting your morning." Behind him stood an older man Margaret didn't recognize, his silver hair and expensive suit marking him as someone of importance. His smile was genuine, which made him more dangerous than Chen. "Margaret," the silver-haired man stepped forward. I'm Richard Maxwell, CEO of Platinum Development Group. I wanted to personally discuss the future of Paradise Valley with you. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. When the CEO himself showed up for negotiations, it wasn't really a negotiation. My kitchen's not really set up for 8 visitors, she said mildly, noting how the men had positioned themselves to block any clear exit from her house. Oh, don't mind my associates, Maxwell laughed. Insurance requirements, you understand? These old properties can be quite hazardous. In fact, that's partly why I'm here. He produced a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. We've had our safety inspectors review the recent incidents in the valley. The Henderson fire, the Mitchell's tax situation, even poor Bill's brake failure. It's clear that maintaining these aging farms has become dangerous and economically unfeasible. Margaret's hand tightened on her doorframe. The threat was clear. They were done playing nice. Funny how all these accidents seem to happen to people who don't want to sell. Maxwell's smile didn't waver. Progress can be challenging for those who resist it. But we're prepared to be more than generous. He opened the envelope, revealing a check with an obscene number of zeros. 5 times market value, Mrs. Wilson, plus a lifetime suite at our luxury senior living facility in Palm Springs. You could live out your days in comfort, not worrying about accidents or property taxes. Like the taxes you had raised on the Mitchell place. Margaret's voice carried a sharp edge now. Or the insurance rates that mysteriously tripled for the Hendersons. Careful, Mrs. Wilson. Chen stepped forward, his friendly facade cracking slightly. You're making accusations that could be considered defamatory. We wouldn't want to add legal troubles to your other concerns. A sound from her kitchen made Margaret turn. One of their men had entered through her back door, uninvited. He was examining her family photos with too much interest. Get out of my house! Margaret's voice was quiet, but carried the same steel that James's had when giving orders. Mrs. Wilson, Maxwell sighed. I don't think you understand your situation. This development is happening. The county commission votes next week on eminent domain. You can leave with dignity and wealth, or... He gestured to her kitchen, where more of his men were now entering. Or we can't guarantee your safety in this hazardous old property. Margaret straightened her spine, 90 years of strength flowing through her. Oh, I understand perfectly, Mr. Maxwell, but I don't think you do. She reached slowly for her phone. You see, my James believed in being prepared, and he taught me that the best time to make an important call is before you need it. She held up her ancient flip phone, its screen showing a completed call duration of 8 minutes and 42 seconds. Your men really should have checked if I was already on the phone when you arrived. Maxwell's smile faltered for the first time. Who did you call, Mrs. Wilson? Let's just say some very interested parties are now aware of armed men entering. An elderly widow's home without permission. Her blue eyes turned hard as granite. Men wearing shoulder holsters on private property, making threats. Did you know my kitchen window gives a perfect view for photographs? Amazing how clear pictures can be in morning light. As if on cue, a helicopter thundered overhead, low enough to rattle her windows. Through the sound, multiple vehicles could be heard approaching on her access road. Last chance to leave on your own, Margaret said calmly. The people coming aren't as forgiving as I am, and they take a very dim view of corporate mercenaries threatening their friends. Maxwell's face had lost all its color. Pull back, he barked to his men. Now! They retreated with the same precision they'd arrived with, but now it had the flavor of fear rather than intimidation. As they rushed to their vehicles, Margaret noticed David Chen had dropped his envelope. The check lay on her porch, already starting to curl in the morning heat. Your money's getting dirty, Mr. Chen, she called after him. But then, I suppose, it already was. She watched their SUVs tear down her drive, gravel spraying from their tires. Only then did she allow her hands to shake slightly as she picked up her phone again. They're gone, General, she said quietly. Thank you for staying on the line. And yes, I got pictures of everything. Sarah Henderson's girl got it all from the barn too, just like we planned. The helicopter circled once more before disappearing, its message delivered. Margaret knew this wasn't over. Men like Maxwell didn't retreat for long, but now they knew she wasn't just a helpless old woman. Now the real fight could begin. She looked at James's photo on the wall. "You always said the best weapon is the one you don't have to fire," she told him. "But I think it's time to show them our full arsenal, dear." The helicopter had barely disappeared over the horizon when Margaret's house phone rang. She recognized the secure ringtone James had installed decades ago, separate from the regular line. Only 3 people had this number, and 2 of them were dead. "Hello, Iron Mike," she answered, her voice steady despite the morning's excitement. "Margaret." General Marcus Crawford's voice carried the same commanding presence it had in Korea, though now tinged with age. "My surveillance team caught everything. You handled them perfectly." James would have been proud. She sank into James's old leather chair, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what had just happened. "They're not going to just walk away, Marcus. Men like Maxwell don't accept defeat gracefully. No, they don't." A pause filled with decades of shared understanding. "Think it's time you knew exactly what James did back in 51. Why certain people owe him, and now you, a debt that can never be repaid." Margaret's hand found James's logbook, its pages worn smooth by time. "He never wanted me to carry that burden. He also never expected platinum development to bring ex-military contractors onto American soil to threaten his widow." The general's voice hardened. "You remember that mission he disappeared on? 3 months when you couldn't get word?" "Operation Starlight," Margaret whispered. James had only mentioned it once, on their last anniversary before his death. "He said it was routine reconnaissance." Iron Mike laughed grimly. "Routine? Margaret, your husband saved 26 men that night, including 3 who'd go on to become generals and 1 future CIA director. We were pinned down behind enemy lines, an entire Chinese division between us and safety. James not only got us out, he did it without losing a single man." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering James's nightmares in those first years. The way he'd map every escape route, analyze every tactical advantage, even on their peaceful farm. "That's why they gave you this land, isn't it?" she asked, pieces falling into place. "The farm wasn't just a reward, it's strategic." James picked it himself. High ground, clear lines of sight, multiple evacuation routes. He turned down a Medal of Honor to keep it quiet. Said he'd rather have land that could feed his family and protect his men if things ever went bad. Through her window, Margaret watched. Sarah Henderson's truck approaching. The girl had gotten the photos they needed, evidence of armed men threatening an elderly widow. But now she understood it was more than just documentation. The other farms, she said slowly. Samuel Mitchell, Bill Henderson's father, Old Man Brown, they were all from his unit, weren't they? "Hand-picked," Crawford confirmed. "James created a defensive perimeter disguised as farmland, each property covering key terrain, protecting approaches, even the road network. Haven't you noticed how it forces visitors to expose themselves long before reaching any vital area?" Sarah's knock interrupted them. "Marcus, I need to go. But first, tell me what resources we really have." "What, James? Set up all those years ago. Everything," the general said firmly. "Military satellites, NSA surveillance, FBI background checks, all off the record, of course. And about 40 retired special operators who've been waiting 30 years to repay their debt to Captain James Wilson." Margaret smiled for the first time that day. "Then let's show Platinum Development why you don't threaten a soldier's widow, especially not this one." After hanging up, she opened the door to Sarah, who burst in with nervous energy. "Mrs. Wilson, you won't believe what Jenny caught on camera. Their men had weapons, and one of them was ex-Delta Force. I recognized." Him from your father's old unit, Margaret finished quietly. Before he and Bill joined James here, Sarah stopped, staring. How did you? Margaret gestured to her kitchen table. Sit down, dear. It's time you learned what your father and James really built here. Why this land is worth more than any developer's checkbook could cover. She pulled out James's logbook, opening it to pages she'd never shared before. Inside were more than just names and numbers. There were maps, contingency plans, and a legacy of protection that spanned generations. Your father wasn't just a farmer, Sarah. None of them were. And this valley, it's not just paradise. It's a fortress, one that's about to wake up after a very long sleep. The Paradise Valley County Commission meeting erupted into chaos the moment the surveillance photos appeared on the screen. Images of armed men entering an elderly widow's home played across the wall as Sarah Henderson's steady voice carried through the packed chamber. These were taken 3 days ago at Margaret Wilson's farm, she announced, advancing to the next slide, showing clear shots of shoulder holsters and tactical positioning. Private military contractors threatening a 90-year-old woman. Is this really the kind of progress Paradise Valley needs? Richard Maxwell shot to his feet, his carefully cultivated calm cracking. This is a gross mischaracterization. Our security personnel are licensed professionals responding to credible threats against our development projects, like the Henderson fire. Margaret's voice cut through the murmurs. Steel wrapped in silk, or Bill's brake failure. Those kinds of threats, Mr. Maxwell? From her seat in the front row, Margaret could see Maxwell's legal team scrambling through documents, while David Chen whispered urgently into his phone. They hadn't expected this kind of organized resistance, hadn't thought an old woman could marshal such a precise counterattack. Commissioner Thomas cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should table the eminent domain discussion until these security concerns can be properly investigated. Maxwell's face darkened. Commissioner, need I remind you of the economic implications, the tax revenue, the jobs? His eyes narrowed at Margaret, and the unfortunate budget shortfalls that might occur if this project faces delays. But Margaret had been prepared for this too. She nodded slightly to Sheriff Tom Parker, who stood up in his dress uniform. Speaking of investigations, he announced, my office has received some interesting information about recent property reassessments. Seems there's been unusual access to our tax records after hours. FBI's quite interested. The chamber erupted. Again, Maxwell's team huddled in urgent consultation while reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. This wasn't the simple land grab they'd planned for. Somehow, their every move was being countered before they made it. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with Sarah and Sheriff Parker, reviewing their small victory. Her secure phone line buzzed with updates from Iron Mike's team. Maxwell made 3 calls after the meeting, the general reported. 2 to private security firms, ex-military contractors with less than clean records. The 3rd to someone in D.C. with a lot of political pull. They're escalating, Margaret. So are we, she replied, watching through her window as unmarked cars quietly took up position along her farm's perimeter. To anyone else, they'd look like normal vehicles belonging to local farmers. But these farmers had served in special forces, and they'd come to repay an old debt. Sarah spread out aerial photos on the kitchen table, surveillance from sources she'd learned not to question. They're moving equipment into position around the valley, construction crews, but the workers all have military haircuts and move in tactical formations. Not construction crews, Sheriff Parker growled. Assault teams hiding in plain sight, same tactics they use overseas. Build during the day, strike at night. Margaret traced the familiar lines of her farm's boundaries on the photos. James had chosen this land for its tactical advantage, had spent years preparing it for a fight that never came in his lifetime. Now his widow would use every defensive measure he'd put in place. "Tom," she turned to the sheriff, "how many of your deputies served with Bill and Samuel?" "6, he answered. "All combat veterans, all loyal to the valley." "Good, because tonight's when they make their first move. Maxwell's too smart to come at us directly again. He'll try to split us up, isolate the farms, pick us off one by one." She pulled out James's logbook, opening to a page of detailed defensive plans. "But James taught me that the best defense isn't about fighting, it's about making the enemy realize they can't win." Her secure phone buzzed again. "Margaret?" Iron Mike's voice was urgent. "Satellite shows vehicles moving into position. Professional operators, at least 20 men. They're coming tonight." Margaret smiled grimly. "No, General. Tonight they're learning why James chose this valley, why he brought his most trusted men here to farm, and why some debts of honor are worth more than all the money in the world." The sun set over Paradise Valley, painting the sky blood red. In the gathering darkness, Margaret Wilson prepared to show Platinum Development that they hadn't just threatened an old woman. They'd awakened a network of warriors who'd been waiting decades to fulfill their promise to a legendary captain and his tactical genius of a wife. The first sign something was different in Paradise Valley came when the old Veterans Bar on Main Street suddenly filled with unfamiliar faces. Men in their 60s and 70s, all with military bearing, arrived in ones and twos throughout the day. They ordered drinks, swapped stories, and casually established overlapping fields of view on every approach to the building. Margaret sat at her usual corner table, watching the choreographed arrival of James's old unit. Each man stopped by her table, ostensibly to pay respects to their captain's widow. Each received quiet instructions and a section of valley to monitor. "Ma'am," a weathered man in his 70s approached, his posture still parade ground perfect. "Colonel Jack Hawkeye Reynolds, retired, served under the captain in 51. Margaret smiled warmly. "James always said you were the best spotter he'd ever known, Jack. Still got your eyes?" "Yes, ma'am. And my daughter's drone company, 12 units, all civilian certified, perfect for agricultural surveys." His grin carried decades of shared secrets. Funny how many old farmers suddenly need aerial mapping. Through the bar's windows, Margaret watched Maxwell's construction crews, his not-so-subtle infiltration teams, positioning equipment around the valley. They were good, she had to admit. To anyone else, they looked like normal work crews. But she'd learned from the best. "They're setting up for a 3-point squeeze," Colonel Reynolds observed, sipping his beer. "Classic insurgency tactic. Control the high ground, isolate the target, then apply pressure until something breaks." "Let them try," a new voice joined them. Margaret turned to find General Crawford himself standing there, decades older than his official photos, but still commanding respect with every gesture. "Sorry I'm late, Margaret. Had to call in a few more favors." The general sat heavily, his own age showing. "NSA's loaning us some surveillance capability, strictly off the books. And that CIA director James saved. He's very interested in a private military company operating on U.S. soil." Margaret's secure phone buzzed. Sarah's voice was tight with urgency. "They're moving, Mrs. Wilson. 3 teams approaching the Henderson place. They've got demolition equipment right on schedule." Margaret nodded to the general. "Time to show them what they're really dealing with." Across the valley, a coordinated dance began. Sheriff Parker's deputies, all combat veterans, set up routine traffic checkpoints on every access road. Farmers who'd served under James took up positions that looked casual but gave perfect coverage of key approaches. And high above, completely invisible, military satellites retasked their orbits under the guise of weather monitoring. Maxwell's teams moved with professional precision, but they were being watched by men who'd written the book on covert operations. Every radio frequency they used was monitored, every tactical frequency jammed by equipment that officially didn't exist. "Sir, one of Maxwell's operators reported, frustration clear in his voice. "We've lost comms again. And these farmers, something's not right, they're too well positioned." Margaret listened through the intercepted communications, a small smile playing on her lips. James had spent years training local farmers in basic tactical awareness, disguising it as ordinary agricultural advice. "Watch your sightlines when planting," he'd say. "Always know your escape routes. A farmer who can't see trouble coming isn't much of a farmer." The first real clash came at sunset. Maxwell's teams attempted to surround the Henderson farm, planning to demolish it under the cover of darkness. Instead, they found every approach blocked by broken-down farming equipment. Tractors, combines, and trucks all mysteriously died. At strategic points, their elderly owners helplessly trying to fix them while coincidentally blocking any tactical advantage. "Ma'am," Colonel Reynolds reported from his observation post, "they're pulling back. Something spooked them proper." "Might be the drone footage showing up on CNN," General Crawford smiled. "Amazing how news channels get interested in private military contractors threatening American farmers, especially when those farmers are decorated veterans." Margaret watched the sunset paint the valley gold, just as it had every evening for 70 years. Maxwell's teams were learning what James had known all along. This land wasn't just worth defending, it had been designed for defense. "They'll try again," she said quietly. "Probably tonight. Men like Maxwell don't give up easily." "Neither do we," the general replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of shared battles. "You know, James once told me why he chose this valley. Said it wasn't just about the tactical advantages or the strategic position. Said it was about building something worth protecting, something that would outlast all of us." Margaret touched her wedding ring, remembering James's words on their last anniversary. He said, "A soldier fights for duty, but a farmer fights for legacy. And sometimes the best way to honor both is to plant your roots where they can guard what matters most." As darkness fell over Paradise Valley, Margaret Wilson and her unlikely army of elderly veterans prepared to defend that legacy. Maxwell's forces were about to learn that some ground is sacred not because of its monetary value, but because of the blood, sweat, and promises that had seeped into its soil over generations. Maxwell's night assault on Paradise Valley failed before it began. His teams found every strategic position already occupied by elderly farmers who had absolutely no reason to be tending their fields at midnight, each wearing night vision gear that looked suspiciously military-grade while riding tractors that somehow blocked every possible assault route. "Sir, we've got a problem," his tactical commander reported through static-filled comms. "These aren't regular farmers. The old woman at the Wilson place, she's got the whole valley wired like a military compound. IR sensors in the trees, motion detectors disguised as irrigation equipment. We're walking into a prepared kill zone." In her kitchen command center, Margaret watched the operation unfold on multiple screens. James had spent decades preparing for this possibility, hiding cutting-edge security systems behind farm equipment and innocent-looking infrastructure. Now his widow was using every tool he'd left her. "Team 2 is trying to flank through the Mitchell property," Colonel Reynolds reported from his drone feed. "Running right into those broken irrigation pipes. On cue, the sprinkler system activated. Powerful jets of water turning the access road into mud. Maxwell's professional operators found themselves bogged down, their expensive tactical gear useless against simple farming innovation. Remember Korea?" General Crawford smiled, watching the scene through military-grade thermal imaging. "James used the same trick against that Chinese division. Sometimes the best tactical advantage is the one that looks completely innocent." Margaret's secure phone lit up with Sarah's voice. "Mrs. Wilson, they're pulling back. The news crews are..." Arriving, seems someone tipped them off about armed men threatening elderly veterans in the middle of the night. Through her window, Margaret watched Maxwell's teams retreat in disarray, their carefully planned operation undone by elderly farmers and agricultural equipment. But she knew this was just the beginning. "They'll switch tactics now," she told her assembled commanders. "Try to fight us in boardrooms instead of fields. That's where the real battle begins." She opened James's logbook to a page she'd never shown anyone. "Fortunately, my husband didn't just plan for physical attacks. Sometimes the best defense isn't a gun or a barrier. It's having the right friends in the right places at the right time." As dawn broke over Paradise Valley, satellites tracked Maxwell's teams, withdrawing completely. But in her heart, Margaret knew they hadn't won yet. They'd just proven they were worth taking seriously. The real war would be fought with paperwork and politics, and for that, she had an entirely different set of weapons in her arsenal. While Paradise Valley slept, Margaret's real counterattack began in Washington, D.C. The general's promised favors materialized in waves of federal investigations. IRS auditors descended on Platinum Development's offices. EPA officials discovered concerning environmental reports. And most damaging of all, military intelligence began quietly examining the company's use of private contractors on American soil. "They're getting desperate," Sarah reported, spreading documents across Margaret's kitchen table. "Look at these land transfers. They're hiding money through shell companies, trying to dodge federal oversight." Margaret studied the papers with the same tactical precision James had taught her. Notice the pattern. Every shell company has a connection to foreign military contractors. Maxwell's not just building houses. He's creating infrastructure for something bigger. Her secure phone buzzed. "Margaret," General Crawford's voice was tight with urgency. "CIA just flagged interesting transfers from Platinum's accounts. They're paying off county officials, but the money's coming from overseas sources. This goes deeper than real estate." In his downtown office, Richard Maxwell was discovering that his carefully constructed empire had serious vulnerabilities. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. "What do you mean our permits are suspended?" he shouted into the receiver. "We've already broken ground on. I don't care about new environmental regulations." Fix it. But fixing it wasn't so simple. Every legal loophole his team exploited somehow got closed before they could use it. Every political ally they approached had suddenly become unavailable. It was as if they were fighting an enemy that could see their moves before they made them. "Sir," his aide interrupted nervously, "FBI's here with a warrant. Something about illegal military contractors and foreign funding sources." Margaret watched the federal agents swarm Platinum's offices through Colonel Reynolds's drone feed. "James always said the best victories are won before the enemy knows they're in a fight," she mused. All those years he spent building connections, gathering evidence, preparing for a battle he hoped would never come. Sarah stared at her in dawning comprehension. "The logbook. It's not just tactical plans, is it? It's evidence. Decades of it. James knew men like Maxwell would come eventually," Margaret smiled. "So he spent 30 years documenting every corrupt deal, every illegal scheme in Paradise Valley. The farms weren't just a defensive line, they were listening posts. And every farmer he brought here was a trained intelligence operator." By sunset, Platinum Development Group's stock had plummeted. Maxwell faced federal indictments, and their Paradise Valley project was permanently suspended. But Margaret knew the real victory wasn't in destroying their enemies. It was in protecting what mattered most. "My James believed that true strength isn't in fighting battles," she told Sarah, as they watched the sun set over their preserved valley. "It's in making sure some battles never have to be fought at all." The Paradise Valley Farmers Market told the story of their divided community. Where vendors once chatted freely across aisles, now bitter silence reigned. Those who'd sold to Platinum avoided eye contact with those who'd resisted. Margaret's Usual table sat empty. Few wanted to be seen buying vegetables from the woman who'd brought federal agents to their quiet valley. "They're calling us traitors," Sarah reported quietly, arranging tomatoes that nobody would buy. "Say we've destroyed property values, killed jobs. The Mitchell kids can't even show their faces at school anymore." Margaret watched Betty Mitchell hurry past their stand, ignoring her greeting. The woman's father had been one of James's closest friends, but fear was proving stronger than loyalty. "Got more problems?" Sheriff Parker approached, keeping his voice low. "Town council's meeting tonight. They're voting to condemn the remaining farms for community development." Maxwell's lawyers found a new angle. Through the market crowd, Margaret spotted David Chen talking with former friends. His smile practiced as he described the prosperity they'd lost. He was good, playing on their fears, their dreams of easy money, their resentment of outsiders telling them what to do. With their land, her secure phone buzzed. "Margaret," General Crawford's voice was grim. "Maxwell's got a new plan. He's turning the community against itself. Divide and conquer. Oldest military tactic there is." Margaret touched the worn cover of James's logbook. "Then it's time for the truth. All of it. James kept one last secret, something that would change everything. But once we use it, there's no going back." She looked across the market at her divided community, at families who'd known each other for generations now, turned into strangers. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with weapons or legal papers, but with truth and trust. "Call everyone," she told Sarah. "Tonight, before the council meeting, they need to know what their fathers and grandfathers really built here, why this land means more than money ever could." As the market closed, Margaret watched her neighbors avoid her gaze. By sunset, they'd either be united again or lost forever. James had prepared for every threat except the one that came from within. Now his widow would have to fight the hardest battle of all, saving Paradise Valley from itself. The first shots came at midnight. Not bullets, but camera flashes. Dozens of reporters suddenly descended on Paradise Valley, all armed with anonymous tips about Margaret Wilson's shadowy military connections. Headlines screamed about elderly, conspiracy theorists, paranoid veterans, and the brave developers trying to bring progress to a backward community. "They're painting us as criminals," Sarah reported, spreading newspapers across Margaret's kitchen table. "According to these stories, we're using military-grade weapons to threaten innocent construction workers. They've even got witnesses claiming James ran some kind of secret paramilitary operation." Margaret watched Maxwell's new strategy unfold with grim recognition. James had warned her about this, how sometimes the deadliest weapons weren't guns but carefully crafted lies. 4 more families withdrew their support this morning," Sheriff Parker added. "Can't blame them. Maxwell's people are offering triple their original buyout prices, plus promises of future development contracts. Fear and greed, powerful combination." The media assault was just the beginning. Health inspectors suddenly discovered violations at farms supporting Margaret. Tax assessors found errors requiring immediate payment. Banks began calling in loans that had been secure for decades. "Classic psychological warfare," General Crawford observed through the secure line. "Isolate the target, destroy their support. Network, then wait for them to crumble." But Maxwell had underestimated his opponent again. Margaret Wilson hadn't spent 70 years as a soldier's wife without learning how to fight on multiple fronts. "Sarah," she called, pulling James's logbook from its hiding place. "Get your camera ready. It's time to show them what a real media story looks like." The truth about Paradise Valley wasn't just in military records or legal documents. It was written in the soil itself, in the blood and sacrifice of men who'd chosen to protect their country even after hanging up their uniforms. As evening fell, Margaret prepared to reveal the valley's final secret, one that would either save their community or tear it apart forever. Sometimes the darkest tactics required the brightest, light of truth to defeat them. Margaret Wilson sat alone in her kitchen at dawn, James's logbook open to its final page. The number written there wasn't just a phone number, it was a last resort. James had made her memorize it 30 years ago, making her promise to use it only when everything else had failed. "When you call this number," he'd told her, "you're not just calling a person, you're calling in the biggest debt in military history." Her hands didn't shake as she dialed. 3 rings, then a voice she'd only heard in old news reports answered. "This is Wilson, Margaret Wilson," she said clearly. "Authorization code Sierra Echo 7. Silence then. "My God, James said you'd only use this if—" The voice belonged to the Director of Central Intelligence himself. "The situation has evolved beyond local resources," Margaret reported, using the exact phrase James had taught her. "Paradise Valley is compromised." "Tell me." Margaret laid out everything: Maxwell's private army, the foreign money, the systematic destruction of a community built by American heroes. She didn't plead or embellish. James had taught her that. Real power responded to facts, not emotion. "You understand what you're asking?" the director asked finally. "Once we acknowledge Paradise Valley's true purpose, there's no going back. Everything your husband and his men built in secret will become public." "James knew this day might come," Margaret replied. "That's why he left instructions. Check classified file, Starlight 1951, subsection Echo." She heard papers rustling, then a sharp intake of breath. "This changes everything. Paradise Valley isn't just farmland. It's—" "The last defensive line," Margaret finished. "A network of observation posts and safe houses, disguised as farms, protecting something so valuable that 26 of America's finest soldiers chose to spend their lives guarding it in secret. Maxwell's people have no idea what they're really trying to buy, do they? No, but they're about to find out." The director's voice hardened with decision. "Authorization granted, Mrs. Wilson. Full operational disclosure. God help us all." Margaret hung up and watched the sun rise over her valley. By sunset, the world would know why Paradise Valley could never be sold, and why some secrets were worth protecting at any cost. Her secure phone buzzed. General Crawford's voice was filled with awe. "Margaret, the orders are already going. Out. Every agency, every department, they're all mobilizing. What exactly did James hide here?" "Not what." Margaret smiled grimly. "Who? And after today, nobody will ever threaten this valley again." Black helicopters appeared over Paradise Valley at precisely 0600 hours. Not news choppers or police units, but sleek military aircraft moving with practiced precision. They landed in Margaret's East Field, disgorging teams of men who moved with the coordinated grace of elite operators. Maxwell watched from his command center, face pale as reconnaissance photos streamed in. "Those aren't regular military," he whispered. "Those are Delta Force. What the hell did that old woman do?" Inside Margaret's kitchen, a 4-star general stood at attention before her, his chest heavy with medals. "Mrs. Wilson," he said formally, "the President sends his regards and his profound apologies for not recognizing the situation sooner." Through her window, Margaret watched more vehicles arrive. Unmarked SUVs carrying men whose credentials made federal agents step aside. The CIA director himself emerged from one, heading straight for her porch. "It's true, then," Sarah whispered, watching the valley transform into what looked like a military operation. "Everything they guarded all these years?" "Your father knew," Margaret replied softly. "They all did. 26 men who came home from Korea with a secret so vital they spent their lives protecting it. James chose this valley for its natural defenses, then brought his most trusted men here to farm, to watch, to wait." The CIA director entered. Without knocking, his face grave. "Mrs. Wilson, we've confirmed the foreign money behind Platinum Development, Chinese intelligence. They never knew exactly what was here, but they suspected. Been trying to buy their way in for decades. Maxwell's private army was already retreating. their vehicles racing for the valley's exits, but they found every road blocked by federal agents and military units that hadn't existed an hour ago. "Your husband's network," the general explained. "It wasn't just about protecting land. This valley guards the largest cache of classified intelligence ever assembled. Dead drops, safe houses, escape routes, all disguised as normal farms. A final fallback position if Washington ever fell." Margaret nodded. "James said sometimes the best way to hide something valuable is to put it somewhere nobody would think to look. What better cover than a bunch of old farmers who seem to care about nothing but their land?" "Ma'am," a young Delta operator approached. "We've secured Maxwell and his team, but there's something else. The men who served with the captain, they're all reporting in. Every surviving member of Operation Starlight. They're coming home." Margaret smiled, touching James's photo. He knew they would. Some debts can never be repaid, but they can be honored. Paradise Valley was never about farming. It was about keeping one last promise to a country they'd sworn to protect. As federal agents swarmed Platinum's offices and military units secured the valley's perimeter, Margaret Wilson watched her community's true purpose emerge from decades of secrecy. The local farmers who'd supported her gathered closer, understanding at last why their fathers and grandfathers had chosen this life, this land, this duty. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. "Now," Margaret replied, "we finish what James started. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won by fighting. They're won by revealing the truth at exactly the right moment." The Paradise Valley Community Center hummed with tension as Maxwell made his final stand. He'd gathered over 200 residents, his silver tongue spinning tales of government overreach and military occupation. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd let Margaret Wilson take the stage. She stood at the podium, 90 years of strength in her spine, James's logbook in her hands. Behind her sat 20 elderly men, the survivors of Operation Starlight, each wearing their service medals. For the first time in decades, "You all knew my James," she began, her voice carrying to every corner. "Knew all these men who chose to farm here, but you never knew why." She opened the logbook, revealing pages of classified documents now declassified by presidential order. They weren't just farmers, they were guardians. The projector flickered to life, showing satellite images of the valley's true infrastructure. Hidden bunkers, sophisticated communications arrays, escape tunnels, all disguised as ordinary agricultural features. "Paradise Valley isn't just land to be bought and sold," Margaret continued. "It's the last line of defense for secrets that kept this nation safe through the Cold War and beyond. Your fathers and grandfathers didn't just farm here, they stood guard." Maxwell rushed the stage, but found himself facing a wall of elderly veterans whose age did nothing to diminish their authority. "This is lies," he shouted. "Government propaganda." "No," a new voice rang out. The CIA director stepped forward, holding up a file marked with the highest security classifications. "This is Operation Starlight's final mission, and Mrs. Wilson just gave you your last warning. Leave Paradise Valley or face charges of espionage against the United States." The community center erupted in chaos, but Margaret watched understanding dawn in her neighbors' eyes. They weren't just farmers or townspeople. They were part of something far greater, and some warnings carried the weight of history behind them.